couple of minutes before we start the panel discussion, and we just wanted to use this time to kind of conclude the case study and case study presentations by having a round of discussions or comments or questions that we can pause, not necessarily based on the last session, but on all the presentations that were held since yesterday, especially seeing what significance they may hold for intersectionality and understanding intersectionality in the Global South, and furthering the discussion about how we can use it in our research methods and also to influence advocacy and policy. I think that would be a good background before the next segment in our program. So if there's any hands in the room or online, and people who would just like to comment, share, based on the last discussion. Is there anything online? Any hands? No. Okay. We'll start off with Rudo and Siviwe.
I don't even know if I still remember, but I think there's something that I'm still holding, and I think it's tied to something Sohaila said about even if you make the referrals, that the culture of reporting, especially where family is concerned, is complicated, and that just really triggered a thought around also something that I think Collins mentioned about the human rights framework. And so in my mind, I'm holding the historical intersectionality framework, right? The original framework, and the human rights framework, and challenging or troubling both of those within our context. Because when we know what human rights can enable, but within a context where our lives are built around like social capital, it's our community. And so the people who come to my aid when I'm in crisis is not the state. And so to turn to the state in crisis feels like, so I'm curious, I'm curious about how we think about a human rights framework or an intersectional approach in the context of the kinds of realities that we do have, where it's easy to just, almost cut and paste, but in terms of like how those concepts move in our context looks and feels very, very different. So I'm holding that question around like, what does it mean for us now here? If we're looking at a queer framework, right? And then that's transported into a context. And for me, every framework is adaptable. Whoever creates it, like your job is done, will do what we do with it once you've put it out into the world. But so my curiosity is, what do we do with it? Or what do we continue to do with it within our context now? Both human rights and intersectionality.
Yeah. I think that also speaks to a discussion that was had when Fazana had her presentation. And there was a question, I think it was from Sipati, that said, do we need to have another framework perhaps for people in the Global South that would kind of address these things or these gaps that we are noticing increasingly in research? Because African research or Global South research has been, to quote Sipati, always intersectional. Yeah. Siviwe.
Well, now you're raising different things in my mind. So, but Yeah, so I had a couple of questions, I think, from the research side. One on data, but also some things that came up during Matt's and Suhaila's discussion. And I think it was related to, getting access and engaging with people on the ground and their agency and right to, decline, right? And I wondered, I think since, I mean, in terms of just feminist research in general, but also intersectionality, and we kind of had this discussion last year as well around the kind of learning dialogue that we were having. A key thing that often stands out is this issue of, positionality and reflexivity. And given that we're speaking about intersectionality, and its applicability in the global south, generally the issues that we are studying are related in some ways. Obviously there's the context, but the people that are doing this work also come from this context. And I'm just curious, obviously, to the presenters in the work that they've been doing, how issues of positionality and reflexivity fit into that, knowing that you might feel when you enter these spaces that you are an insider, but the people that you're interviewing don't regard you as one, right? And how you actually reconcile that and negotiate that when speaking to participants and trying to address the issues that might be very important to you coming from that context. And as social science researchers, there is this idea that, oh, well, you're a researcher. You're not an African, you're a researcher. You're not a woman, you're a researcher. And you need to be subjective. And there's this this false objectivity that comes into research at play, and how that informs the design part. And then to the question on, I think, how we include the stories of marginalized people in this type of research. And I think we were speaking now particularly around LGBT communities and households, or households that are, kind of single female-headed households and such. How do we actually document that within the data? And if people have suggestions on that, because a lot of the time it's not necessarily, reflected in the data for various reasons. And whether or not you ask the question on self-identification of groups of people, they might not feel comfortable identifying that in a census, for instance, that is being, compiled by a complete stranger, and there might be safety issues involved for them. So how do we actually kind of illuminate those stories, knowing the dangers that might be involved in some of the research that we work with, even if we talk about issues of gender-based violence and patriarchy? How are we actually showing the reality of how the economy and society are experienced by the communities in which we work in? But yeah, excited to hear your thoughts on that.
Thoughts? Okay. So Lisa. Okay. We'll just go Lisa, Jamila, and then go back to Rudo. Just.
Cute. So I had ideas floating in my mind yesterday like Lego blocks, and they kind of settled into some sort of structure today. I think it was Sahela's presentation that did it. And what I've been thinking about is in how we do research in the Global South, and whether we call that research intersectional or not, is sort of a theme that's sort of come up throughout the presentations, is the importance of listening. And I don't know that we always, especially if we're doing quote unquote development work, that we always focus enough on our role as listeners to the people who we're working with, and also this idea of bearing witness. And that for me links to the transformative nature of people feeling heard. And a lot of the time, at least in my experience and the experience of my colleagues at the center, is that for a lot of people, the space to be heard, it's the first time somebody's actually sat down and really listened. And like, for reals though, like, I genuinely care about what you have to say. That's in itself a transformative experience for the people we work with, but also for us as part of the research team. And I can't quantify that. I can't put that in a report to our funders in a way that is meaningful, but that is something that happens in that interaction. And something that's so important, in at least in the kind of research that we do, is relationships. The people we work with are participants, or co-researcher participants in our case, but they are also human beings. And so when we try too hard maybe to be researchers and be subjective and stuff, we sometimes miss out on that relating to each other as humans, and which also helps with the listening, and it also helps with building relationships over a longer period of time. But then also thinking, and there is, I think, a shift over the last however long, like decade or whatever, towards a kind of research that does that more, that focuses more on the listening, which is great. And then your comment or question about resistance made me think about the importance of actually, if we are listening, are we also listening to the silences? Like, what are people not saying? Because sometimes that's super significant. And silence as a conscious form of resistance. I will choose not to respond to your question, and there's a reason for that, and I'm probably not going to tell you that either, and that is my right. And that's pretty cool as well. But also just the idea that people are not in any way obliged to share their lives with us, but so often they do, and that generosity gets to me every time. And then ethics. So Sahela was also saying, I think towards the beginning of her presentation, that when you get into the field, your work so rarely looks exactly the way you planned it out. So in real life, things happen, and you have to sort of maneuver while you're in the field or in the process. And ethics can be one of those things. And doing ethics every day, all the time, in every interaction with the people we work with our co-researcher participants, can be really, really difficult. And it's something that we talk about a lot and try and talk about with our co-researcher participants. Like, if they have produced a visual artifact in which their face is visible, our ethics committee says absolutely not. You cannot share that product anywhere ever. But for our co-researcher participants, they're very proud of the work that they've produced, and it's an amazing piece of work, and they should be proud. And should they not be able to decide whether or not and where or not they want their work to be shared? And to assume that they don't understand what happens when you put something on the internet is also problematic, because young people have grown up with this stuff now. Their view on it is not the same as ours. And it just feels weird for me to have to tell our co-researcher participants, well, sorry, you can't have your name on this because we're not allowed to share your name with people. And that's weird. But then, and I'm nearly finished. But then thinking about what Matt was talking about with gender-based violence and accessing services and referrals, we have to have a referral sort of plan in place, and we tell the ethics committee that this is what we're going to do. And even that we're going to map out the services that are available in the communities that we work in. But what if there aren't any? Because that's a reality. We had like a 6-year project in one community, and the whole way through we had one social worker who was from an NGO who was able to provide psychosocial support like immediately. So what do you do then in those circumstances? That's a huge ethical issue. And also the consequences of reporting. If we then feel obliged to report, what are the consequences of that for the person who's disclosed to us? So we're going to report that their stepfather is abusing them, but the stepfather is a breadwinner in the family. We report him, he gets arrested. Then nobody can eat. The kids can't go to school. All of these things are things we have to think about and take into consideration when we're doing ethics every day on the ground. And I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Stop.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to reflect on this issue around whether or not people use the term intersectionality in their research, or they call it intersectionality, and whether or not that matters, you know. And I must say I was also one of those who, probably you'll see in my presentation, was able to do my research without using the term intersectional. So I do identify with those who feel that way. But my question is, does it matter that we call it intersectional? And I guess that's also a methodological question that we probably need to answer. If we hope, and I think this is where we are going in terms of our next presentation, we hope that our research will have an impact on policy with an eye towards praxis, then these are things that we need to resolve, because what I liked and what I've seen from yesterday is that framework, 5 points that people were using to assess their research in terms of determining whether it's intersectional or not. And I would like to hear from others what they think. But for me, I think if we want our research to be impactful with an eye towards praxis, then we do need a framework.
I don't think I'm answering per se, but I'm just sharing my experience. So during my training in anthropology, I've come across a lot of writing on interpretive reflexivity specifically, and I'd like to share some sources that are very reader-friendly. They're not too theoretical, but not too fluffy. So there's Bernard's skills of participant observation, which touches upon rapport, building trust, continuity in the field as well, and when to exit the field, which is something I feel we all feel a burden of, like when do I say it's done? So that one is called Skills of Participant Observation. There's also Lichterman, Lichterman, on interpretive reflexivity. That's the title of the paper. And one of my favorites is called The Hard Work of Small Talk. It's part of a book on discourse analysis by Dreisen and Jensen. And it discusses this value we have to give to everyday conversation and the value you have to give to interactions you have outside when the mics are, when the recording stops, the kind of value you give to when the research is over, what comes out of the field and out of the people we work with. And the last two are Jackson's I Am a Field Note, which talks a lot about this dynamic and power dynamic between researcher and researched. And the last one is Carolyn Ellis's The Ethnographic I as in I, which merges this whole position of researcher within how the study is conducted and how people interact with the researcher going to the field. I also want to touch upon Lisa's point on internet and social media. I honestly struggle as well, because even on a personal level, I feel like we're all commodified in the spaces we are in without our consent being taken, be it if you're a presenter or a bride or a birthday girl, whatever you are, kind of. I had a huge fight with the person who took videos of my wedding because he thought I'm a marketing material that he can post online. So I feel like this is a very big ethical question that we have when it comes to consent. And yes, now fieldwork is actually moving more towards visual fieldwork, towards even documenting it in visual, be it videos or pictures, or accounting for the activities that are happening in the field. But we don't really account for, if one of the 109 women in the room don't want to be on camera or don't want the reuse of their pictures, what do we do then? So it's more of some resources, but also a heavy question on ethics as well. And then back to calling it intersectionality, I feel like that's the whole point of coining the term. I feel like even with illnesses, if you go and you get diagnosed and you have the name for the symptoms you have, you tend to take it more seriously. So I feel like if you offer yourself the landscape of doing intersectionality, you give it to yourself, okay, you have those corner kind of social categories you want to look at, it's more likely that you will not miss them. Rather than, yes, knowing you're being ethical, you're being inclusive, you have a very, very robust framework, but it doesn't necessarily bind you to go back and look at race. It doesn't really force you to go back to gender dynamics. So I feel like because intersectionality has very clear categories of the social, it forces us to think in those ways rather than believe that we do, but not really do it. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I hate to be that person, but unfortunately, I do have to kind of move us along in terms of the program so that we have a longer discussion later on when it comes to the recommendations. And I think this discussion can lay the groundworks for the recommendation session and discussion that we're going to have later on. But in order for us to have time for that, kind of have to be the person who packs it here. And at least we have these ideas and these comments floating in our minds for the next discussion. And a lot of people, presenters, a lot of people in the room have been talking about the policies and the advocacy. How do we go back? How do we advocate? How do we include this in policy? Are the policies relevant? Are the frameworks like the human rights relevant in the context? So I think this next panel is going to cover a lot of that, and we want to be able to give them that time as well. So we are about, the next segment session is a panel on intersectionality and policymaking. So our panelists are going to be Dr. Jamela Hoven, Nicole Maloba, and Collins Liko. And I am going to read out their bios as they are making their way to our living room so that they can get comfortable and be seated for the next presentations. Okay, so Dr. Jamela Hoveni, as a social researcher, leads the Feminist Economics Project at the Institute for Economic Justice. She holds a PhD in economics and an MCOM in financial markets from Rhodes University. Dr. Jamela brings a wealth of experience, and prior to joining the IEJ, she spent 9 years in academia, both as a lecturer and researcher, specializing in gender analysis in economics, trade, macroeconomics, and finance. Her corporate background includes the roles as a financial analyst and economist. Jamela is a self-published communist feminist. Communist. Okay, this is about to be a very different discussion. No, feminists. I hope everybody heard me. Feminist. Feminist creative writer, authoring an anthology, Random Walk, Modern African Histories. She is a spoken word poet who focuses on empowering women and challenging gender stereotypes. And then our next panelist is going to be Nicole Maloba, who is a lawyer and policy researcher committed to bridging localized efforts in women's socio-economic rights with broader legislative gender reform and feminist macroeconomic analysis in Africa. She currently leads the Economic Justice and Rights program at Femnet. She previously served as the Africa Advocacy Advisor at Christian Aid Africa and coordinated the CEDAW and Microeconomic Working Group at IWRAWAP. She holds a master's degree in gender and law from SOAS University of London, a postgraduate certificate in sustainable development, and a human rights law from the University of Antwerp, and a LLB, Bachelor of Laws, from Middlesex University. She enjoys music and exploring Africa's hidden gems. Yes, they do. They do. We have a poet. Yes. And our last panelist is Collins Liko. Collins Liko is the coordinator of the Economic Policy and Human Rights Working Group at the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Prior to joining the network, Collins was involved in advancing the economic and social rights of marginalized grassroots communities from a development and economic policy and human rights lens. He has a great deal of experience in research, capacity building, community organizing, and movement building. He has been engaged in advocacy at different levels, including at the United Nations. He holds a BA in Sustainable Human Development, Social Sciences from the Catholic University of East Africa, a certificate in Monitoring and Evaluation. He is currently a final year student studying a master's degree in Public Policy and Administration. So the prompt is, what is the importance of intersectional development research for informing policies for a just and sustainable global economy? Our presenters have 20 minutes each to make their presentations, after which a Q&A session will resume. Can we please have their presentations? Thank you. Dr. Jamila, you'll be first.
It was. Check. Let me see. Okay. Good morning, or is it good afternoon, everyone? Thank you so much for inviting me to this space to be a part of this amazing project that I've been a part of in the last few days, or just the last 2 days. So we were asked to reflect on this question, and I'm going to stand behind the podium, but I'll try to move around. Being a lecturer, at heart, I like the comfort of the podium. But anyway, I prepared some slides, and I feel a bit now like I'm over-prepared because my fellow panelists did not prepare slides because they thought this is a panel, so we shall have a good discussion. But I felt under pressure when I was asked to share my slides, so I prepared some slides. So just in thinking about this is a very broad question, I was saying earlier today, but I think having sat through the presentations yesterday, the case studies. I was able to kind of fill in the blanks, because I must say, when I came here yesterday, I didn't know what to say. Where do I start on this? Just to say that I really enjoyed the report that you produced on intersectionality or intersectional research. And I must also say that as a feminist researcher, I've always done intersectional work. It was my first time seeing intersectional research, those two words together. And in a way, for me, it felt like our mainstreaming intersectionality. But what does intersectionality actually mean? I don't want to repeat everything that has been said, but I just wanted to share a little bit on what it means to me. And a lot, you can read that definition, has already been said. But for me as a feminist, and also as a woman, as I said, a woman from Limpopo, a girl who grew up in rural Limpopo, I always had questions around my community, around the women that who brought me up, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mother, around their well-being, around their voices, around their agency. And in thinking about all of that, I believe that let me just say, I can summarize a few key words in terms of how I saw that research evolving, and how that research was intersectional for me. Bearing in mind that I had these questions from when I was a young girl, like 5, 10, 15 years old. So for me, I think the issue around research embedded in context has already been exhausted. The issues around social justice and change-oriented has already been spoken about. I want to emphasize the issue of Black feminist research, and being one who comes from that tradition, that for me, that is what it means to be intersectional. The issue around lived experience, and as I said, for me, it has always been theorizing from my place, my positionality as a young girl from Limpopo. And then finally, research that is historically situated. I've always had a thing, being a poet, I've always had a thing about voice, centering the voices of marginalized people. So for me, intersectional research has that aspect. And I heard someone say yesterday, and I was quite happy that they mentioned the issue of voice, centering marginalized voices, which is what I had always wanted to do. So we spoke a little bit, some people spoke a little bit about intersectionality and positionality. And just again, reflecting on what has been said over the past 2 days, your report, I was able to bring out a few keywords that spoke to me personally in terms of what is intersectional research. So it's a conceptual tool, yes, we heard. It's an ethical stance, I think, and a form of praxis. For me, I think that's quite important. When I go into the field, as a social researcher, as a girl from Limpopo, as a lecturer, as an economist, as a poet, as all these things that I wear on my shoulders, it at the end of the day, it's about my ethics and my stance that I bring into the research. And just to say that most useful, I think, for us, what I have seen over the past couple of days is how intersectional research or intersectionality can be a versatile conceptual tool or a lens that can be applied to our research. So I'm just going to move around a bit. If I move and just do this, doesn't work. Does it? Okay, it does. So I just want to move around a little bit and say, as we said yesterday, and we also said today, we've been doing intersectional research, especially as feminists. And for me, that has been about centering the experiences of Black women from my community. This is a picture. The lady in front with the stick is actually my aunt. She's my paternal aunt, which means she's my father's sister. And the lady in the green with the green jersey, that's my mother. And the rest of the women are the women who come from our village. This is a project on elder women's pensioners in Limpopo, in my village, of which my mother manages. She's the manager, and my aunt is a part of. And as I said to you, you know, I grew up watching these women and having questions around them, their lives, and so on. So a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I decided, you know, there are some questions that I finally want to investigate, you know, as a researcher, not just but also as a community member. So I undertook this research, which I will speak about a little bit. I'm not gonna bore you with the details because I think you've already sat through so many case studies, but I thought it was important for me in answering how exactly can intersectional research be used to inform policy, to talk a little bit about this research. So just a little bit of a framing around how I sought to answer this question. I thought about the research questions, which I think we have exhausted again. I also thought about the policy questions. You know, what does this imply? What kind of policies will promote sustainable development? Okay. I won't focus too much here. I think we've already discussed this. But I think in doing my research and also thinking around the use of intersectional research, we have spoken about the issue of how it is helpful in highlighting inequalities. And there are various inequalities that we can talk about: gender, race, and so on. For me, in this context, with this community, I was interested in rural versus urban inequalities. And in my next slide, you will see how I was saying that rural women in South Africa are the most marginalized. And this comes from a historical context or a history of apartheid's special development, where they created these homelands in various locations around South Africa. So we've inherited this legacy that has resulted in a situation where most rural women are marginalized economically, socially, and politically. So this was the context that I not only grew up in, but I was working in as a researcher. At the same time, this is a curious thing. Rural women are actually the #1 supporters of the ruling government. If you look at provinces like Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and Eastern Cape, those are the highest numbers for the ANC. It's like 76, and most of those people are rural women. So in a way, we have a government that is not accountable to its huge constituency of rural women. So some of the questions that I was interested in here in this community, so questions around the climate crisis and the care crisis, the extent to which climate and care crisis intersect. And I think in this particular community, which is my community, these effects are quite prominent for various reasons. One of those reasons is for the reasons that I've already mentioned, those rural versus urban inequalities. But the other reasons are around agriculture being a huge form of livelihood for this community, and also the role of specifically elder women in care work in the rural countryside. This is quite unique, I think, to this, not to this particular community, but to South African rural areas, where over time we've witnessed this outward migration of young people to seek employment in the CBD, leaving young children and the elderly behind. So we have this situation where rural elderly women are basically undertaking a care work, you know, in terms of child work. At the same time, there's also been a high increase in elder care needs with aging populations and so on. So this is the research that I undertook. I was interested in understanding what are their care needs, what are the climate change impacts on their livelihoods, and especially the intersection between elder care and child care. Okay, so you have elderly women undertaking child care. I mean, one of the women that I spoke to, she's a great grandmother who's 94 years old, who's undertaking some child care. So I spoke to the grandmother and I asked her, so when you are not home, who looks after these children? And the grandmother said, my mother, who is the great grandmother, and she's 94 years old. So of course, the intersection between child and elder care results in this situation where elderly women are very vulnerable. They are vulnerable because they are elderly, therefore they are frail, they are sick, but they're also vulnerable because they are undertaking this child care. Finally, they're vulnerable because they are poor, you know. So for me, it was quite clear when I started having these conversations, even before I undertook the research, that this had to be the approach to doing this research. Okay, so I'm going to skip here. I think someone said this thing about insiders versus outsiders. So I can stand here today and say I am an insider, but maybe they don't think that I'm an insider because I'm privileged, I don't live in the community anymore. But I like how they always would refer to me as Mwana. Mwana means our child. So in a way, I hope I'm an insider, but maybe I'm not. By the way, that's the great grandmother who is 94 years old, who's still undertaking childcare. Okay, so I'm just going to fast forward by just giving you a very brief kind of key findings and why these findings are important. So the findings around the high burden of childcare that women in this community undertake. The findings around their vulnerability, which is due to the fact of high rates of poverty, unemployment, and systemic poverty. Their vulnerability due to the fact that they are involved in precarious forms of employment, mostly subsistence farming, and so on. And then finally, which I think is quite key, which we don't talk often enough about, is infrastructural inequalities that we see when we move from the urban to the rural. So this is lack of access to water, electricity, transport, which actually intensifies their care burdens and so on. Okay, I wanted to speak a little bit about time poverty because this was quite important and prominent here. How women's time poverty was even intensified by, you know, the various infrastructural gaps and infrastructural inadequacies and so on. And let me maybe just pause here before I move on to the next section. So I think for us as macroeconomists, my friends being in the room, and I must say lately, I sometimes feel a bit ashamed to call myself an economist. We have such a bad reputation. I prefer to call myself a social scientist. But for us, the questions around the macro and the micro, right? How the macroeconomic context, policies that we are putting in place impact the micro was quite prominent and quite important. Most economists don't think like that. They don't wonder about the granny who's 94 years old who lives in the rural village and how a particular policy will impact on her livelihood, on her well-being, and her burden of care, for example. They don't, but they should, because if we hope to put in place policies that can make a difference, can promote sustainable development, that has to be our thinking and our framing. So, and I like this framework of the care diamond. I don't know how many, 5 minutes, okay, I'll be done. How many people in this room are care researchers? But the framework of the care diamond is useful because it shows us how care is distributed, you know, within a state, right, between families, state, market, and so on. And sometimes some of the policies that are put in place around how money is spent on social services, infrastructure, and so on, ends up redistributing, shifting, you know, the burden of care, either onto families and households and so on. So in this context, in this community, we see how actually the women here are shouldering a lot of this burden because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the neglect, because of being marginalized, because of being poor. So by thinking or looking at a framework like the Care Diamond, we can actually start to ask ourselves questions around when we put in place specific policies, how does that impact communities? Because essentially this is what it does, using the example of care. So like I said, the research undertaken here and the case studies that have already been presented shows that to think of women in generic terms is inappropriate. It's overlooks a lot, okay? So we need to be intersectional in how we even think about women. You know, people think, if we think of men and women and therefore we take into account gender, we are intersectional, but it's not enough. I think it has already come up that we need to be even more intersectional in how we think about women and so on. So we need a shift, and the shift is thinking around how public policy can actually be used to impact social outcomes, impact health outcomes, well-being, and so on. That's the kind of shift we need as economists, I believe. We spend too much time thinking about the macro level. I'm almost done. So these are just examples in terms of, you know, a tax policy, how does that impact households? A social policy, how does it impact a particular community? And I believe today when you go away, you'll think of that community from Zanin, which is my community. You'll remember my aunt in the front dancing because she was so happy that we were there to document their stories. So then it will become a real issue, right? It's not just about people and women and so on. It's about communities, okay? So as I said, the connection between the macro and the micro is important, and thinking about the impacts of macroeconomic policies such as austerity on communities, this is also a good one. It highlights the importance of investing in social services. This is just a summary, just to say that an intersectional lens helps us to understand the unique disadvantages faced by communities, which allows us to design impactful policies. Intersectional research along with disaggregated data by race, gender, and location is useful, specifically time use data. So South Africa's time use data is not great. We were working earlier with colleagues from Brazil, and they were telling us how their time use data is more up to date in terms of documenting how women use their time or people use their time. So our data is not great, but that's also quite useful because it tells you, it zooms into the individual. How much time do you have? And allows us to have even a conversation around time poverty. This is my last slide, don't worry. So, and also if I think my presentation or my example of those rural women from Zanin also shows that, for example, there's a difference between rural women and urban women. While they both face food insecurities for different reasons. For rural women, it's issues around the impacts of climate change and how that impacts their livelihoods and their subsistence farming and so on. For urban women, it's for different reasons. People talk about high food prices and so on. So again, you see how it's quite important to just have that lens in order to reveal these vulnerabilities that are unique. Okay, so the rural women I interviewed experienced severe time poverty due to income and infrastructural inequalities, as I said. For me, I think, and I was making some notes earlier, now they completely flew off my mind, but someone said something that I think was useful around designing policy, impactful, having contextual data in order to help us to design impactful policies. So let me stop here. Thank you.
I like standing in podiums because they make me feel tall. Just a minute. So thank you so much for inviting me to this great space. So much work that everyone is doing that's actually fitting into being able to have different impacts and changes. So I'm really happy to be able to contribute to the conversation today. My work around, so I work in economic justice and rights, and mainly trying to advocate for women's socioeconomic rights from the feminist macroeconomic perspective. So of course, over the years, we found that a lot of interventions for women's socioeconomic rights, especially by governments, are largely at the micro level. And so you find governments will be able to have small tokens of, money, those small money to be able to do farming. Sometimes they push you to entrepreneurship, to be able to have like salons or whatnot. But we largely felt that this sort of distracts women from actually engaging in macroeconomic policy making, which actually that's where the policies are made, which actually trickle down to actually impact their livelihoods, such as healthcare, public service delivery and financing, etc. And so when I was invited here to speak about, of course, how intersectional approach is able to influence policy, there's so many things that we do. So even as Dr. Jamila said, it's so broad. I was like, oh, what do I tell you? Which tea do I give you? Which one do I not? But I'll just give you a brief story because I like to tell stories. Over the years, I've discovered that you know how economists are, your language. So depending on different platforms, I'll just give you a story which explains why I do what I do, how I do it, and what is it that I'm trying to be able to achieve. So once upon a time, the time being even now, in the vibrant and diverse land of country A, the climate began to change dramatically. The weather grew more unpredictable, and natural disasters became more frequent and severe. Coastal areas experienced rising sea levels and caused significant erosion, sweeping away homes and infrastructure. In this unfolding crisis, women bore the heaviest burden. They were the ones who had to rebuild their homes, restore their livelihoods, and reconstruct community infrastructure after each climate disaster. On the top of this, they faced increased health issues, with diseases like dengue fever, malaria, and yellow fever becoming even more common. But why has the climate in country A changed so drastically? Who is behind this upheaval? Enter country B, the largest polluter and contributor to global emissions. The industrial activities and relentless carbon footprint are key drivers of the climatic changes wreaking havoc in country A. Returning to the struggles of country A, to cope up with the damages caused by these climate-induced disasters, they often borrow money. And when additional borrowing isn't possible, they sometimes suspend debt repayments to redirect resources towards disaster relief and recovery efforts. And in other instances, they cut back on essential public services, which are crucial to the well-being of women and girls. And who do they borrow from? You guessed it, country B, the very nation responsible for their plight. So one might think that country B, aware of the role that they play in country A's suffering, would feel empathetic, but no. Country B, what they like, in Kenya we like to say character development. Country B shows country A character development, and they impose even harsh conditions that push country A further into poverty, creating a vicious cycle of dependency and debt. But why doesn't country A have enough money to address these issues? The answer lies in a painful history. Country B has long been exploited by country A's people, land, communities, natural resources, and economies, leading to deep-seated impoverishment, and they continue to do so using new methods to maintain their control and influence. So this is the tragic tale of the interconnectedness of gender, debt, climate, financing for development, and well-being, and the urgent need for systemic reform. It is a story that demands we acknowledge colonial legacies and the neocolonial iterations and promote feminist alternatives that center the well-being of people and planet. And so we need to move beyond rhetoric to implementation to strengthening language that is intersectional and reflective of the needs and lived realities of women and girls in macroeconomic policies, beyond an ask, and instead demand transformative action and accountability. So that's, in summary, is what I do and how I attempt to do it. And so, of course, over the years, using an intersectional feminist approach, what we've actually discovered is that it's not necessarily about making sure that every oppression is being named, but it's actually trying to make sure that every person is accounted for. And we found that over the years, in trying to be able to have different stakeholders come on board and we actually use an intersection approach in terms of the policies they're making, especially whether you're dealing with governments, civil society, policymakers, you're dealing with the IMF and World Bank, and you're trying to explain why austerity measures actually impact women and girls in terms of public service delivery and financing, and advocating for regressive tax measures. It's a huge task, and no one actually wants to hear intersectionality. And there's a lot of essentialism which we found whereby they just assume African women and girls, you're all put in the same bracket. But no one actually asks, especially like when I was asking yesterday on Fazana, how poverty doesn't stop at finding that women are disproportionately poor. So now we have to look at which women from which region and what sort of policies maybe have been implemented that contribute to them being identified as poor. And then you also now look at the history and the context in terms of how they ended up being, identified as poor. So we've seen, of course, there's a danger of single category descriptions, which don't necessarily reflect the reality that we have multiple identities. So for us, we use intersectionality, which requires us to think differently about identity, power, and equality. So I'll give an example of, I'm sure if you've been watching news, Kenya had this finance bill when it was a whole whirlwind of, emotions, riots, etc. And of course, for us as Femnet, what we did was be able to look at the finance bill and look at it from an intersectional perspective and be able to look at various articles and see how do these articles impact women in all their diversity, women and girls. And one of the articles, just focus on one specific, was they wanted to introduce an eco-levy. And this eco-levy would mean that we would have to pay more taxes, for example, on we would have to pay more taxes on sanitary towels, but it didn't matter whether it was locally produced or whether it was produced from outside of Kenya. Now, the issue here is that what our argument was that the government did not ask themselves why there was such a whirlwind as to why Kenyan women and girls were trying to say, we don't want to use locally produced pads and we prefer using pads that have been produced outside of Kenya. So if ladies, you might know this. So there was a huge campaign about my always experience in Kenya at some point, some 2 years back. And different women were coming on board to share the experience with my always. For the gentlemen in the room, always is a type of sanitary towel brand. And for the ladies, you must know that, of course, the sanitary towel used in South Africa, for example, if you travel to the States or you travel elsewhere, very different quality, very, very different quality. And so women were sharing their experiences and they were resulting to, SRHR issues, a lot of reproductive issues in terms of using the locally produced sanitary towels, because they were making them with, cheap quality products, cotton, some plastic, etc. And so our argument, of course, from an intersectional approach was governments did not necessarily look at how having an eco-levy on this would actually be able to impact girls differently depending on, of course, your class levels, etc., and different sort of multidisciplinary identities. And so we're able to lobby around it. We did get, of course, the eco-levy removed, and they said, okay, fine, now it's not going to be on locally produced items, and we'll also try and remove it from international produced items as well. But that doesn't necessarily fix issues. and sometimes we lobby around having intersectional approach to policies, but the win is it's such a long shot. And those are the experiences we have within our work that sometimes I wish I was working towards a micro, because then if it's to make sure there's water accessibilities, I can lobby for a pipe to go to a village and they'll have water, as opposed to macroeconomic, which is a long shot. But it's important to be consistent and to be able to have solidarity around it, because once we get the win, it actually trickles down to actually have much more impact. The other thing also, of course, intersectionality has also helped us, value a bottom-up approach within our work to be able to get like a lot of impact. So, for example, when we do research around feminist trade policy, and for example, the AFCFTA, and when we look at that sort of research, a while back, of course, we do say that our work is intersectional and we approach, but later on, the more you do your research, the more you realize, I'm not as intersectional as I thought. So you go back to the drawing board and you're trying to advocate around opportunities through the African Continental Free Trade Area for cross-border traders. But then you're writing a concept note and you're writing to your R's and you're looking at the background and methodology, and again, it's qualitative, but you haven't necessarily also gone down to actually ask cross-border traders what they actually need. So the woman who's at the borderline selling you tomatoes and onions, have you gone to ask her, hey, this new, first of all, they don't know anything about the AFCFTA, so they don't know which opportunities you're talking about. They already have challenges with their government systems. And so when you go there, you'll find that women actually need different things than what us in policy spaces might actually be advocating for. So we constantly have to take ourselves back to be able to make sure that the peoples who we are trying to represent legitimize the research that we're doing, but also contribute to the process from the beginning all the way to the end through the dissemination. So actually getting that, you'll find that a lot of the research we did ended up just a lot of those cross-border trader women just want good wash facilities at the border. They're it's not safe. You find a lot of them go through, GBV issues. They're harassed. Most of them also have financing mechanisms which work for them. So some will even tell you, we don't need to be digitalized. It's been working for us. What we want is that we don't want to have to pay huge taxes when we are selling our products, but we should also get different dynamics to set up. So that actually helps having that bottom-up approach to actually apply intersectionality within our work. But I think also what has really been interesting, because it also came up in some of the questions, was the whole men-to-men approach. Because we've done that as well in terms of, we've had attempts in terms of also bringing men into the conversation, especially about women's economic empowerment and women's economic empowerment within macroeconomic perspectives. And we've also had, for example, capacity building initiatives. Our flagship program, which is the African Feminist Macroeconomics Academy, which we've been having for the last 7 years, which we're able to, build the capacities of feminists who are working within economic justice and rights from diverse spheres. And it actually expanded to sub-regional because, again, we had to take that intersectional approach to be able to have and target, for example, women and girls within specific sub-regions in Africa based on their context, their needs, their understandings, etc. And that has actually been able to help grow the feminomics. We call it the feminomics movement, because now we have a lot of, if you look at the amount of data that comes out on feminist macroeconomic analysis, even 2 years back, it's largely grown. Just because we also have a lot of people who are taking up this course on African feminisms. And I know IJ also has a summer school as well. So there are even many more summer schools. When Femnet and IJ started the summer school on African feminist macroeconomics, there are many more summer schools which are also coming up. So that, and taking that intersectional approach in terms of, unpacking and going to sub-regional perspectives also helps in terms of making sure that the feminist macroeconomics we're advocating for in terms of policy making is aligned to the context and to the needs of the African women and girls in those sub-regions. But what was really interesting is there's a time we're also having this session in the grassroots level. And what happened was that you find that you're empowering these women, and sometimes when they're okay, she can come, but when it's lunchtime, you see the husbands outside. They're like, you need to come home and make lunch. and then playtime is done. And so there's a lot of, and that's why we try to have decolonial approaches, because there's so much unpacking and unlearning that we have to unlearn and teach, and sort of knowings that empowering a woman doesn't mean she necessarily has to step aside from what maybe culturally is known as some of her contributions. She's happy to come and make lunch, but she's also happy to be in class. And so how do we maneuver those sort of introspection? So we also started having, before the African Feminist Macroeconomics Academy just used to be for women, but now we also started including men into the conversation, especially since you find a lot of these men at the leadership position in ministries of finance and economics, in key tax jurisdiction offices and whatnot, and we can't be able to speak like in a silo. So we also need them to be able to advocate for that. And then just something I wanted to touch on, because it also came out with a question about human rights. We've also been doing a lot of, in terms of using intersectionality, of course, to advocate for policy. And I'm sure a lot of South Africans must be conversant with them. Do I say it? My pronunciation will suck. The Mlangu case, or the Mlanga case? I think it's Mlangu. I hope I pronounced it well. Anyway, the domestic worker case. She was a domestic worker, yes, which in terms of the precedent which was used, and also intersectionality was actually part of the obiter dicta. I'm trying not to use legal language, but we had information which was shared within the court proceedings, which has actually been used to also, it used to actually fight for them to get the judgment which they got, which actually got to represent, domestic workers and to be able to access social protection mechanisms within, and to be identified as people who are also in the labor industry formally. And those are some of the wins in terms of how intersectionality has been used to also get policy. Now, of course, the realities of it actually trickling down and the implementation, because, and I wouldn't know, of course, if a lot of cases have also now been able to use that as precedent to be able to advocate for domestic workers to be able to get the same benefits as formal employers. But a win is a win. And we largely also in Femnet advocate, of course, for a rights-based approach to women's socio-economic rights, because we've seen that when we say we're using a rights-based approach, it doesn't necessarily also limit itself to strategic litigation. It goes as far as also just language. And I think we need to normalize using rights-based language even in our advocacy, in our work, and I think even as researchers, in terms of using, for example, terms as duty bearers, obligation, because we need to normalize moving away from the mentality that we are asking our governments for favors when it's actually our rights. That small step can actually be able to influence governments to actually be able to get the impact that we're looking for. And we largely also do that in terms of also showing women, like we've also done that in terms of empowering women on their socioeconomic rights using a rights-based approach. And when we have those sessions, especially with women at the grassroots level, what it has actually impacted is that, because I'm not sure if it's the same in South Africa, so during election season, when he's coming to ask you for votes, they'll give you small tokens of money and they tell you come and whatnot. But women are now actually demanding. Also, when there's public participation about a specific tax policy, women are actually contributing to those, because we've built their capacity on feminist macroeconomics to understand how these policies impact them based on an intersectional perspective. So they actually contribute, and they're like, no, this doesn't work for us. Or when they go there and they try and lure them with money, they tell them, no, we want hospitals because this will mean ABCD. We want good employment with benefits. We want schools for our children. And that also, contributes to actually changing the retrospect of how governments are actually being able to trickle down how they make their policies. So it's actually been the fight is still, of course, ongoing. We win some, we lose some. With the finance bill, as I mentioned, we're able to kick out the finance bill and have a lot of lobbying around that, but we've still seen trinkets. Our government is like a cat with 9 lives. We still see, it's still ongoing. We still have the same articles being implemented even now post the finance bill. But I guess for us, the win was the fact that we can come together and also have reflexive solidarity in terms of putting women at the forefront in terms of feminist interventions, and also women having various forms of resistance, organizing in the various ways they came ahead to be able to tackle that. So I'll just stop there for now because I'm cognizant of time. But looking forward to chatting further.
Thank you very much. I can confidently say that it is the most difficult thing to try and do, in terms of speaking after Dr. Jamila and Nicole have actually spoken. They've absolutely exhausted everything that I would have said. So thank you very much, Siviwe. I want to really appreciate you inviting me into this space. But I also want to say that yesterday I did a lot of listening. I've done a lot of work on human rights and social justice, and I think from around 2013 until now, I'm almost 10 years old in the field. And I've done a lot of talking and saying a lot of things in this life, to the extent that now I've learned the art of really just listening more and saying less. So I'll be very brief, like super brief, and then we can perhaps create more time to hear more from you and the rest of the participants. So yesterday, or rather today, one of the key lessons that I'm taking home, having learned from all the presentations yesterday, is that one, intersectionality as a concept, or rather as a framework, cannot exist in a vacuum, right? Looking at all the case studies that were, shared yesterday and partly today, I realized that they're very contextual. I mean, you look at intersectionality, but it's contextual. And I liked what I think Rudo, yeah, I liked what you said. Intersectionality is adaptable. I mean, it's not like it has to be looked at as something that is fixated or something that has to be done in a certain way. You need to twist it to fit into your own context and then be able to use it. So having said that, and Nicola, I just want to underscore one thing that you said. I'm sure men in this house, me included, we are good husbands. So we will not show up anywhere. We will not show up anywhere. We will try not to show up anywhere when you are in class, indicating that, hey, I'm hungry. No. We'll make sure we let you finish your classes. So I have listened to the definitions of intersectionality, like the best part of yesterday and today. They are not very much the same, but there are certain things that are very common, right? The issue that intersectionality is about understanding the different power imbalances, the different disadvantages, and the different discriminations that people face. That is for me, that is the baseline, about intersectionality. So it doesn't matter how you want to really define it, as long as you know those three things, or rather, you understand how it impacts on all of us. For me, that is very key. So I'll be super brief, as I said. I just, in terms of looking at what people have said about intersectionality, and then I would love to also situate the whole conversation in the global context, because otherwise, if we do not understand what we are up against, then it's difficult for us to think about how it impacts us intersectionally. So I'll talk about that. And then lastly, I'll just talk about why is it very important that, in terms of us thinking about development, then intersectionality forms, a very important part of it. So I just picked some definitions. Of course, the Oxford Dictionary. I also looked at the Society for Research on Adolescents, but also even picked, an interesting perspective from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, looking at it as a lens. And I think yesterday someone talked about, looking at intersectionality as a lens, which we often do, but also how practically do we actually integrate this into our daily, programs, our daily activities that we do. I'll not dwell on that so much because I think there is a broader or rather common understanding of what intersectionality is all about in the room. I'm sorry, I'm a social scientist, and by the virtue of being one, I'm very wordy. And the reason is not to make it difficult for you to read, but the reason is to make it easy for you to understand what I'm saying. So I'm very sorry about that. So I work with the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That's our website. And we work quite closely with social movements. Social movements are organized groups that are fighting for social justice. And one of our very interesting component within the network is that we have a working group called the Social Movements Working Group. And this social movement working group brings together movements from different parts of the world. And I'm glad to mention that Abalali Basem Jondolo is actually one of our very good movements. So they came up over time to, kind of concretize and, try to understand and deepen our understanding of what are some of the global conditions that social movements, communities, and all of us are facing. I'm bringing this up so that when we talk about intersectionality, then you understand how these problems intersect and kind of, affect all of us. So I'll not be digging deeper into everything, but just to mention, so we have, impoverishment and dispossession amid abundance. So social movements are saying that we live in the most productive world right now, and we have enough resources to educate, feed, and, take care of everybody, house everyone. And that is for sure, that is the truth. But these resources are actually in the hands of a few people, and you'll see this as we move forward. A few people own a lot of these resources, and many of us are actually very poor. There is also the whole problem of corporate capture, and this speaks to what Nicole was saying. You come and pollute, in the name of employment, industrialization, and all of that. So we have corporate capture where, some of the major global corporations actually control a lot of what is happening in our countries. They've gone ahead to capture our governments to the extent that they actually heavily influence policy making in the government in favor of them making profits, but then at the expense of all of us. And you'll see that, whether it's about the environment and everything, corporate capture, the corporations make those decisions. We also have the problem of deepening inequality, and I think this is something that all of us have spoken about even yesterday. It is in the history of the world, we've never seen this level of inequality, and you can read, one of the Oxfam reports there. I know of where 1% of the world owns 90% of the global world, wealth, and then we have 99% of us owning just 1%. So that is the level of inequality that we have. But I think I've broken down in terms of looking at the Oxfam report there. For example, when you have 1% in Asia, for example, you have 1% of the population owning, I think, is it 50 or 48% of the wealth in Asia? That is crazy. You can imagine the level of inequality in Asia. We also have the degradation of ecosystems and climate crisis, and I think my two predecessors speakers have actually alluded to that. Climate crisis is no longer a myth, it's a reality, and is impacting us very, very seriously, disproportionately. Whether you're a woman or a man, you are feeling the impacts of the climate change. For those of us in the social justice field, growing repression, many of us who are agitating for social justice, really with grassroots movements and with communities, we are facing a lot of repression, because of the work that we do. Governments do not want to be put to account for the kind of policies that they make, for the kind of decisions that they make. So a lot of people are facing repression, resisting corporations, resisting authoritative governments, but also resisting being pushed away from their lands. So that is the context. We also have, colonialism. This is something that has not gone away, for sure. Yeah, thank you. This is something that has not gone away. We've seen a lot of historical, exploitation. I think Nicole talked about, the current situation of very many countries in the South. We are all indebted, so much so that we even don't have money to, invest in social public services like health, because we have to focus on debt repayment on a daily basis. In our country, Nicole, you know that 70% of our daily domestic revenues actually go into debt repayment. So do we even have money to put on health? We don't. And many countries in Africa face the same problem. We have capitalism, inequality, and all of those. We'll share the slides. Having said that, all of those issues affect all of us. That is the bad news. Like you're affected by the corporate capture, you're affected by the deepening inequality, you're affected by the climate crisis. Like all of them as issues affect all of us. So intersectionally, that is. So I decided to think about, for those of us who do advocacy, what would it really mean in terms of intersectionality? What would it mean in terms of advocacy? And intersectionality being a framework that really helps us understand, and look beyond the traditional way of looking at issues, really helps us to dig deeper into understanding, some of these issues. So, for example, it will really deepen a holistic understanding of the complexities of the social issues that we need to deal with in terms of advocacy. It would also help us really have what I would call inclusive policy solutions. The issue of the one size fits all does not apply here, because not all policies can address, all issues unless they are tweaked to address certain issues. And really, intersectionality could be one of those things that really help us. Yesterday, a number of us alluded to the fact that intersectionality could really create a lot of homogeneity in terms of making people understand that, this issue is affecting all of us, and that could really help in terms of building strong alliances and solidarity to be able to push back on some of these issues, as well as really helping to get data-driven and evidence-based kind of advocacy. So it encourages us to really have disaggregated data that captures very many of these aspects. And then there we go. Why would this be important for all of us? I think that intersectionality could really help us dig deeper, and be able to address the root causes of economic inequalities. Some of them are systemic. Until we get deep to really understand how do these issues promote inequalities, or how do they come about, what are the causes, it is difficult for us to create policies if we do not understand some of these root causes. So intersectionality would really help to identify some of the structural and systemic economic factors that we need to address, and that could help us in terms of shaping our policies. I also think that, in terms of data, although many of us say we want to use the UN data, but we also have what we call community-driven data, as well as other agencies that produce a lot of data. But how do you produce comprehensive data? You need to find mechanisms like intersectionality that helps you to, go beyond what people, if you are talking about gender, there are so many things under gender that we need to understand. So really, intersectionality could help us do that. But it could also help us understand the diverse experiences different people experience because of who they are, whether it's class, whether it's gender, the geographical locations, and all of that. Yes, it really helps to empower local communities, and I think Nicole mentioned about the aspect of people participating in conversations that affect them. And under that, I said a couple of times I've come across communities saying you cannot do anything about us without involving us. So nothing about us without us. I think that is very, very critical in terms of really communities shaping the kind of policies that they want to be able to then address the economic problems. I talked about context specific, and I think this is something that people have also talked about. There is no one single economic policy that can actually address all the issues. Sometimes there have to be a way in which you contextualize these solutions. And one other thing that I wanted to mention, just as I finish, we live in a world where macroeconomic decisions are made by macro institutions. And these institutions have interest. Some of them, as I said, some of these macro economic policies are shaped by corporations who have interest. And so sometimes cascading these macroeconomic policies, as Dr. Jamila said, to then be able to address microeconomic issues is very difficult. And so there are things that we'll have to grapple with even as we think about solutions moving forward. And lastly, advocating for just-oriented policies. Intersectional analysis could really help us to advocate for adaptation of policies that prioritize justice and equity in economic development. And one last thing, perhaps intersectionality, because these issues must be looked at holistically. When you want to talk about social justice, you want to talk about environment, and you want to talk about human rights, these issues must be looked at in tandem, because the environment affects all of us. So other social issues affect all of us, and you cannot, in terms of human rights, we do not necessarily separate. You don't want to look at, if you don't have access to health, or rather you cannot say, I'll give you access to health and I won't give you access to water. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So all of these issues must be looked at in tandem at the same time, because they affect all of us. As I said, I wanted to be super quick. Those are just additional points. Sustainable solutions, intersectionality development research, to look at environmental sustainability alongside social equity. And that means that the economic policies that we want to put in place should be designed to promote not just growth, but also be able to handle the ecological aspect of our lives, as well as the social well-being. And lastly, the last two, inclusive policy formulation and evidence-based decision-making. As I said, I wanted to be super quick and very precise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Round of applause for our panelists. Okay, so we're going to start our Q&A session. I'm looking for questions online. Are there any questions online? Comments?
There is, but it's related to the treatment.
Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon. Once again, I will introduce myself. Ivan Mendoza from the Colombian Embassy in Pretoria. Habari Yako Collins Liko. I lived in Kenya for years and 7 months, so I speak a bit of Swahili. Pole pole. So, Colin, thank you so much for your intervention. I was actually waiting for you because currently our government is implementing an inclusive policy formulation through the Free and Productive Women Fund. There is a program initiative called She Exports to Africa. And the approach of this policy it has a comprehensive intervention that strengthens women's entrepreneurship, enterprises, and/or women organizations for human development, making stronger their economic autonomy and productive growth. Recently, we have the first exploratory mission of this initiative to South Africa at the end of August with 30 led Colombian women businesses to explore the market, but also for them to go back to Colombia and to, with all the feedback they have here, how to improve their portfolio of services and goods. The next step is going to be Kenya. And this is a project that is expected to be implemented for a year. Currently, they are in the internationalization process. They start first doing intervention, also working on the mental approach of the women, because remember I was talking about economic autonomy. And when I met the executive director of this women fund, when they talk about economic autonomy, is for women to decide what I'm going to do with my income, not just to pay school fees, food for my kids, housing, but also for them to decide what else they need as a humans. So the question is, what is going to happen after this 1 year program for them? So listening to you, that you have a lot of research on this intersectionality, maybe it will be of your interest to be in contact with our Colombia embassy in Kenya and to check how you can be part of the post process and to analyze if this inclusive policy formulation has been successful for this group of women to achieve those targets and goals. And maybe if this is successful, can be replicated in other countries from the global south, because this is an innovative policy implemented by the current government. And so, as I said, I think you will be very interested to meet our ambassador in Kenya, who is also part of this project, because, as I say, the program focused to Africa. She exports to Africa because we want to connect Colombia with Africa through economic diplomacy. So that was my remarks, and I do thank you for that, Musurisana.
Certain properties, but and the table that we're thinking of, this fabulous and pitch. Right.
I don't want to have a reputation for always having a thing to say. But your presentations have all been so insightful, and so they do raise a lot of questions. So thank you all for this panel discussion, and for actually drawing our attention again about how kind of the macroeconomic policies have micro level impacts. And I really appreciated your intervention, Nicole, about intersectionality in policy, not necessarily, and we found also because of the different contexts that we've been dealing with, not only being about trying to cover everything everywhere at the same time, but the importance of trying to ensure that everyone is accounted for, and the importance of policy around that. And as much as you all were complaining about how broad the topic was, I thought all of your discussions tied in very well with each other, particularly with Dr. Hoveni's first comment around how intersectionality helps us to ask, specific policy questions that deal with the experiences of communities and individuals on the ground, and then leading to this discussion and examples, practical examples of how to actually influence policy. And finally, with Collins as well, speaking to kind of how intersectionality can help us to shape those policies. So just two questions, and one, if one of them is for, I think, the next panel on intersectional grant making, if some of our colleagues from the IDRC are connected, and then one for all of the panelists, and we touched on this a little bit with your presentations. But this is also because I think Dr. Hoveni is going to run off before the recommendations. This question of kind of what are the strategies or kind of practical recommendations from your work, and particularly the work with the IEJ as well, in actually trying to influence policies using this kind of intersectional research. And we've heard some inputs around advocacy and lobbying and how that takes place. At the Southern Center, we're often trying, one of our objectives is around influencing policies, right? And we always debate, what does that mean? And given our position within academia, there are certain kind of restrictions in terms of how that works. So how then do we bridge kind of that knowledge or the gap between research and policy making? And then I think to this question, I think Collins, you might be able to speak on this a little bit more. And I think both Femnet and IEJ also deal with this, the importance of mass mobilization in informing policies. A lot of this and because these issues that we're talking about are affecting specific individuals and communities, a lot of the policy changes also have to deal with the influence from kind of the local level, and how do we do that in informing communities about policies, informing communities about rights, and the kinds of strategies that might be out there. But I'll leave. Oh, okay. For the question on the IDRC, I think then, or even to the participants, is, you know, we've had conversations around dissemination, and a lot of this is all about, you know, sharing these stories, mass mobilization, as I've spoken about. But there's also this question about the international development community, and what their role might be in this, both from a kind of funding perspective, but also in amplifying these experiences and taking them to the international spaces where they can be recognized. What role do you see for kind of the international development community, and also for development research funding organizations in particular? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And that was just a nice reflection on what we've been doing as well. So my question was pretty similar to Saviwe, so I'm just going to have to be more blunt. How do you think we're doing? Because you mentioned micro, macro. How do you think we're doing sort of using an intersectional approach or extending intersectional research to policy? And part of the reason I was thinking about that is because there was much more agreement in this room over the past 2 days than I had probably anticipated. And all of us appreciating complexity, right? And the nuance of overlapping vulnerabilities. But I wonder if it wouldn't be uncontroversial to suggest that policymakers sometimes don't do so well with complexity. Tell us what you want us to do and how effective it's going to be on the whole, on average, you know, for most people, which in some ways is the opposite of intersectionality. And it's not a dig at policymakers, it's the environment in which they work and how we sort of communicate with them. So when we were talking about rural women and their overlapping sources of vulnerability, I almost thought cynically to my head, I was like, yeah, we've given you Women's Month. We've had some BEE. We'll mention land reform if it makes you feel more comfortable. Yeah. 16 days of activism. Maybe we'll give you 17. I don't, you know, it's the difficulty of the complexity and how are we doing? Not us in the room, but where's this going to take us, and what's the role there?
Thank you. Okay, it's just me. Yeah.
Okay. So my thoughts are a little still sort of in a formative state, so I may not be as coherent as I would like to be. But so I came to this meeting from a position that was not that thrilled with having to sort of format our framework into an intersectionality frame, right? So that's the approach from which I came. And so one of the things that we've been discussing outside of the main event was the fact that in social science research, many of the sort of, we talked about MISRA as those 5 categories through which we understand intersectionality. Those are sort of like standard practices in social science research, right? So, I mean, if so, and one of the slides that I actually didn't show in my presentation, the last slide, was that from WMC, we want an intersectional perspective in development research to be a baseline, like a basic sort of like position from which one does sort of development research, right? The complexity and all of that to be the bottom line, basically, from which you approach things, right? So I want us to also sort of keep that thought when we are having this conversation. Particularly also, I mean, I feel like we've lost the conversation about the fact that this approach, this naming of this approach, comes from a particular history of Black feminist interventions in the global North, right? So I think maybe we think about that a little bit as well, because it is informed by a particular sort of historical developments and particular historical requirement, right, to address sort of law reform in the US. Okay, so now, I mean, having said all of that, I think that the intersectionality framework, as sort of produced for us by IDRC, right, is given us a particular sort of a toolkit, maybe, right, and particularly if you know, say, sort of like research in economics or research in sort of legal research, basically, right, is not traditionally seen to be doing that kind of like socially embedded research that is required, then I think it's enormously useful. And as Sohaila said, we need a I think a couple of people said, we need a framework, right? And if this framework is useful, then I suppose we can use it, right? I mean, there's no question about it. And also, as a result of this meeting, I think we are also sort of giving the intersectionality framework a lot of meat in some sense, right? We are growing it in some sense, right? I mean, I think one of us stated that, you know, all frameworks are flexible. Somebody makes a framework and other people use it, right? So, I mean, as a framework that has been sort of like, we've been challenged to engage with, I think it is something that we can take forward. I don't think there's any problem with that. But I think even in sort of like what Collins laid out in terms of like the larger background within which we do our research, right? The larger sort of global background. I mean, so the power of like knowledge production and the power of framework production, right? I think we should just we should sit with that awareness. Okay, we don't necessarily have to reject an intersectionality framework just because it came from there, but just sit with that awareness that this is how we came to it, right? And also, I'm sure, you know, in the next session we will be talking about the politics of funding, for instance, right? That also informs how we engage with frameworks and all of that. I mean, if these frameworks are actually pushing for better policy and better knowledge production and all of that, okay, we'll use them, but I think maybe not lose sight of where it's coming from and the context within which we are accessing it.
Can respond.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. I think Siviwe asked the most comprehensive questions. I don't even know where to start, but it's all the world. So I'm just going to, I think your first question was around success with policy advocacy and change and so on. So I think the IAJ has had some good success, as you would know, in various areas, the SRD grant being one, and various others that do not come to mind at the moment. I'll speak more about our project, our feminist economics project, which is a new project. And we have various kind of work streams and areas within which we work. And that makes me think also about how, in going back to our various works and projects and so on, we cannot speak about intersectional research or intersectionality. We have to come back to the project level and say we're talking about debt or tax or care and so on, because that is the level within which we will engage with communities and also in advocacy. So I think for me, sitting here listening to all of you in terms of the way forward, that was my first thought, that, okay, practically, what does this mean for our advocacy strategies, for our communities, as I was saying? And then how does that intersect with policy? I think those are the questions. So for me, I think that, so one of the things that we are actually mainstreaming within the IAJ is the care framework, care as a framing around which we think about women's issues, women economic empowerment. So often when people talk about care, they're like youth care, child care, elder care. But for us, care is a whole framing of thinking about social issues around women economic empowerment. And one of the policy, what we are trying to push, particularly for next year with the G20 South Africa, presidency, is a national framework for resourcing for care. So that's how, through tax and debt, and I keep pointing to Nicole, and I think she knows why. It's because Femnet also works a lot on tax and debt. Through that, that's how we resource for a care strategy in South Africa around health care, education, elder care, various other things. So for us, I think if we can succeed in getting that on the agenda, which is the plan of the G20, and getting G20 governments and to adopt that framework of a national strategy to resource for care, that would be a win. So again, the point being, yes, we are still talking about context-specific research and how it impacts advocacy, but I just wanted to give you a concrete example. Mike was saying policymakers are not good with dealing with complexity. I think we know from our engagements with the Treasury, they are not always useful sometimes because, because of those issues. But I think through our engagements with the G20 and so on, we hope to at least create that awareness within policymakers. And as Nicole was speaking, we have our summer school, we have various workshops that we do with policymakers to capacitate them in these areas of intersectional research, care work, and so on. So that we hope to influence them, we hope to shift their perspectives, but we might not always be successful for various other reasons that I won't get into now. I think that's it. Let me just stop here and allow the others to comment.
Hello?
Sure.
Thank you for all those great comments and insights. I guess a lot of questions to just think around. So I'll just start with a comment around economic empowerment and, of course, economic autonomy. So the feminist movement actually pushes back from using the word economic empowerment. Largely because most times we feel, and it also will allude to why you're saying what happens after the year, because of the sustainability component. And so you really push women into entrepreneurship, but you're not trying to be able to create decent employment, for example. And so then you're left stranded after a year of trying to be able to try and make things work. And so when we think around, for us, when we think around economic autonomy, it's beyond, of course, just women having money to be able to decide what they want to use with the money, but to be able to actually have access and control over productive resources. And that's how we look at economic autonomy. So that also now helps in terms of when you're looking to be able to economically empower women, what exactly you're looking that they'll be able to actually have a sustainability component beyond now that year period. So it would really actually be interesting to be able to see what's coming out of that and to be able to sort of see how sustainability components can be applied. On the question on how to bridge research and policy, of course, different stakeholders have different approaches, and every time we have to always take a step back in terms of what are we trying to lobby around and what are we trying to achieve depending on the different stakeholders. So yes, as you mentioned, especially in terms of dissemination with in international development, they have certain expectations in terms of the research, even the tone, even the language. They have certain expectations of what you can share and what you can speak. They're not big on the lived realities component. We don't want feelings here. We want facts. And that's how they are. But for us in Femnet, we're really big on sharing the lived experiences, because that contributes to you seeing how the decisions you're making are actually trickling down and impacting. And it's very, very important. And so even in those international development spaces, we always, if we're not in a position to actually get the women themselves and the girls themselves to those policy spaces to actually share their stories by themselves, then of course we work through being able to either maybe even share videos, but we always find a way to be able to make sure that those stories are part of those processes so that they can see that this is what this is contributing to. And so that also helps in terms of getting specific feedback in terms of the dissemination. Also, some of the things we also done, and this will also allude to the importance of mass mobilization, which you asked around. Of course, in Africa, I think the stats might have changed now, but last, I think it was about like 70% is like youth. Like, yes, so you reach a point, you're like, in law, we normally say it's easier to change the law than it is to change people. So, of course, even within the legal sphere, sometimes you find it's we have specific targets and entry points, because changing people's perceptions to try and tell them, you've seen also how men think and whatnot, and the different challenges we've shared is a longer process. So it's easier to just get an article and be able to lobby for a general recommendation in CEDAW, and you're like, yay, yeah. But in terms of like for us, what we did realize, and you can also see especially what came out with the finance bill, we have a lot of young people. And because we have a lot of young people, we need to be able to tap into what sort of impact you can be able to get by engaging with young people. So, for example, we've been looking around how, for example, to be able to have a gender and microeconomics module in tertiary education systems in like university level. Because what happens is that this decolonizes the process of how they think about gender and microeconomic policy making, as opposed to trying to, make them unlearn things when they leave the education system. So now what we've been doing, especially like with AFMA, we're already targeting people who have already finished school. So now we have to unpack and unlearn a lot of things. But we kind of thought about it, like, hey, what if we actually advocate around, we're trying to be able to create a module which can be implemented in different African universities. And so when they go into whether private sector and whatnot, they're already thinking, what are the impacts of women and girls with this policy making, whether you're in PwC or whether you're in private sector or civil society. So that's how you're able to garner, of course, a lot of impact in terms of mass mobilization. So it can be very, very powerful, especially if you're strategic in terms of your entry points. It can even be as simple as also like academia or even journalism and media, podcasts. There are a lot of people who listen to podcasts these days. So we also try and make sure that we unpack macroeconomic conversations and policies in information which is easily digestible, so that people can actually be able to engage with it without seeing the connections. We also saw sometimes people don't see the connections until you actually unpack them. So even for like, especially like for women and girls, like when we're out doing a lot of lobbying around the finance bill, you find, of course, the value of my maintenance, me doing my nails, my hair, has largely increased. But you're thinking, economy is tough, but you actually unpack, do you know why? And then the next time they see in the newspaper that Kenya has taken another loan from the IMF, they're really like, my braids are about to be super expensive. This actually trickles down, and this is why the issues, because those same women, or you find your favorite even, it's as making the connections as even the saloon. Like the saloon used to go for, maybe a lot of them closed down during COVID. Those are linkages to the macroeconomic sphere and the financial architecture, which people don't automatically get. And so when you actually use different methods of actually unpacking and making the linkages, a lot of people get riled up, and that's how they're able to demand accountability. So that also helps in terms of a mass model. And then the question about how are we doing? So, in my opinion, I feel like we're definitely ahead than where we were before. In all honesty, it might not be where we would like to be, but we are way ahead than where we were before. I think that also in terms of using intersectionality, just like Fazana was saying, there's this notion of having to use it also as a term of what you realize as a term of a token term. So it's not really because you're applying intersectionality, it's because a donor wants to see intersectionality in the proposal. So you have to mention that this is the approach you use. They want to see specific terms in your reports, in your working and whatnot. And then we also get distracted from actually focusing on actually using that approach, but trying to make it look like we're using that approach. So it does also indirectly have its own essentialism of also grouping women. As I said, you read a lot of reports and they say African women and girls in all their diversity. And all in their diversity is a lazy way of saying I'm using intersectionality, but maybe I'm not really using intersectionality. So it's blessing and it also has a curse. But I definitely feel that in my opinion, I feel that we're not doing great, but we're doing good. But I think the question we should ask ourselves is in terms of the intentionality, but also the political will, because even our own government leaders don't apply intersectionality. I've sat in meetings when we're discussing here with in government processes, and you say, so did you use an intersectionality? I was like, we don't have intersectionality, because Kenyan women are Kenyan women. Our Kenyan women are happy. Our Kenyan women need this. We've given Kenyan women money, they're good. But they've not asked different dynamics of Kenyan women, for example, in arid areas of Kenya and their needs, and Kenyan women in coastal areas, or Kenyan women in Muslim-prone, Muslim communities, or Kenyan women in Christian communities. Like, there's so many different dynamics. So I think I'll stop there. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Sibiwe, next time I want to be the first one to speak so that these two do not bulldoze me, right? Yeah, that bulldozing me, yeah. So next time I want to be the first one. Thank you. Yeah, my brother from Colombia, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to think about how we can work together on she exports to Africa. Yeah, that is an opportunity to explore and see how the whole conversation around intersectionality can actually be embedded into that conversation. I also just want to mention to you that, Africa has a lot of issues when it comes to trade, when it comes to economic policies and other issues. And one of the very concrete things that are happening is the continent is now discussing the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I've been part of those conversations, and one of the protocols is about women and girls and the involvement in trade. And I think that is a very concrete area to think about. How do we, and I don't want to talk about influence, but I'll come to that at some point, but how do we use that as an opportunity to create an environment in which, women from Colombia and perhaps around the African region actually get to be, empowered, or to some extent have an opportunity to participate in the economic undertakings that actually benefit them, but also improve their lives across Africa. Let's talk about the global south. So yeah, I'm happy if you could put me in contact and we can continue to talk about this perhaps over lunch. But yeah, thank you so much for that opportunity. Sivivo, you are always asking us very difficult questions, but but yeah, I appreciate. The challenge is welcome. Yeah, practical ways to influence policy. First, I want to mention that last week, but when I was in a conversation with we had our global strategy meeting as a network, and people were talking about influencing policy, and that didn't go very well with everybody because influencing seems to be a very cosmetic term, and sorry, so to speak, just because it could go anywhere if you influence, right? It could go either way. But people are now talking about meaningful involvement and participation in policy making, because we want to make a policy that speaks to our issues, not what the politicians and everybody else wants, but how does it address our issues, our lived experiences, the issue that we face every day. So we want to have an opportunity to meaningfully participate in making a policy that speaks to the issues that we face on a daily basis. So, your question is very interesting. There are different levels. It depends, because honestly, when you want to be involved in policy making, and I think Dr. may have spoken to this. I mean, we have macroeconomic policies and we have microeconomic policies. So you need to make a decision in terms of at what level are you working on. Where I work, we are both macro and micro. Macro, we are at the IMF, at the G20, and we are trying to really nail down, certain policies that we feel would be very fundamental in terms of shaping how our micro, because the IMF makes policies, for example, that impacts how Kenya operates. In fact, they decide. They are the ones who made the finance bill, just so you know. And because of the top-down kind of approach that the IMF is using and these other multinational institutions and these other, global economic policy-making decisions, they make the laws, then bring them down, then our governments have to, push it through our throat. And as Kenyans, we said, no, we are not going to accept that bullshit. So we rejected it. But and there is a conversation, I'm sure Nicole must be aware of this. We have what we call the Okoa Uchumi Kenya, which is a movement in the country, is working so hard to push back on IMF policies, and we are part of it. And the reason is that the IMF is fond of making new liberal economic policies that do not necessarily speak to our issues. They are new liberal in the sense that they benefit the IMF. They don't benefit us. They benefit the IMF and the wealthy individuals that benefit from the whole economic system that is very new liberal and very capitalist and very extractive. So, and we said no. So that finance bill did not pass because we were not involved in making it, honestly. So in Kenya, as she said, and I guess other African countries, we really participate in making policies at the national level. And this is something that has increasingly gained a lot of momentum, but also improved over time, because when we started, participation was a cosmetic process, as I said earlier, but now people are beginning to learn that if you do not seriously involve yourself, it will impact you tomorrow. So we are getting even more serious. So we will have to make a decision whether we want to cascade our participation both at the national level and then take it to the regional and global, because they go, I think, back and forth. I mean, you want to use the global perspective to inform your local as well as the other way around. And then in terms of mass mobilization, that's an interesting question. And one of the things we are doing as a network where I work is, given the fact that we are a network of over 300 members, and one thing that is for real here is that we do not share the analysis, the thinking, the ideologies, because we are so many of us. So one of the things that we do as a network is to build what we call a shared analysis of the issues that we face. This is the one way of bringing everyone on the same table, on the same page, so that if all of us in this room are now agreeing that this is what intersectionality is, it is very easy for us to then begin to move forward with one position, right? Because we understand what we are talking about and we know what our demands are moving forward. Otherwise, it is difficult to begin to think about pushing an agenda when we do not agree. So first, for me, build that shared analysis, build those shared narratives, and then come up with a position or demands that all of us agree to. Then let's push that as a collective moving forward. For me, that is what could really be very helpful. And then in terms of the international development communities, I'm fond of saying we need to think about ways that we can, globalize the local and localize the global. How do these things play back and forth? But I liked what someone has talked about, the bottom-up approach to some of these things, because the only way policies can work is if they address our issues, and our issues are actually at the grassroots. So to what extent do you want to involve us in making policies that actually affect us, and then let others learn from what we do? And then at your level, to what extent do you actually ask us or involve us in making policies at that level, but then cascading them to help us without really, just looking at your own interests as institutions? So how do we globalize the local and localize the global? I think that is the bigger question that I always ask myself. Mike, thank you very much. You like putting us, yeah, I know, in a corner. I don't know why, but that's just you. That's I think we are doing so well, Mike. Where I work, and I think this question also addresses your question, Dr. Hanifa. One of the key things we've said as a network is that we want to embed intersectionality into our work as a principle. So we have 5 key principles, but one of them is that our work must be grounded in gender intersectionality. Okay, sometimes they call it gender, but I just want to say our work must be embedded in intersectionality, because being a network, bringing together so many people, you can imagine the diversity, you can imagine the different ideologies and all of that, but how do we ensure that everyone feels comfortable in the network? Then you have to make sure that each and everybody's issue is actually taken care of. So how do you do that? Just through intersectionality, because there is no other way you could do that. So we try to embed that into everything that we do. When we mobilize guys for a meeting, that is the principle that we follow. When we are putting together a workshop, even the concept that we write has to be embedded in that kind of thinking. And that is how we will continue to promote this as a framework. Because otherwise, talking about it here and leave it here, it ends here. So unless we also make this as something that we want to, incorporate into our daily things that we do administratively as an organization, I think for me that is very, very fundamental. And I like what you said, Dr. Hanifa, that how do we make that as a baseline? And I think I'm answering your question. First, institutionalize it. Institutionalize, intersectionality, and say everything that we do, this is what is going to inform how we do it. And then that becomes a practice. It becomes something that we do moving forward. Thank you. I spoke so much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. I think we had a question online.
So the question is from Nelson Chipangamite. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Says, thank you very much for these insightful presentations. What would be the practical steps to mainstream intersectionality? Unless it is mainstreamed, it would be difficult for us to reach critical mass where intersectionality is sort of institutionalized. So I think it ties into very well, but like asking more on the practical steps of mainstreaming it. I think Ruda really wants to say something.
Don't kill me, please. But I feel like the question is similar to, is it Mike? To the same question. So, I mean, I think one of the things I keep thinking about is when you spoke about it, you said it's not that the policymakers are resistant. It's that they just need the simplicity. And so if we understand ourselves, right, as researchers, as the people that we are, as the coders in the back, so I don't think we need to be obsessed with like ensuring that everyone can read the code, because you still use your devices without knowing the code. But if we are the ones writing the code, how do we package it in a way that the end user, the policymaker, still gets a deeply intersectional frame without needing to engage with the idea that it's intersectional, right? But like, how do we invest our time and energy as the code makers? That's the only thing that I'm holding. So I'm curious about, does that help us?
And just to add this part, because I'm from the government, it's not just the policymakers, also you have to think about the policy implementers. In my case, most of my work on a daily basis is to implement what we receive from the policymakers. And if it's very complex, then it makes us complex due to the lack of resources, not only financial, but also human resources. So we need to make the quickest as possible to make sure that those policies are implemented on time, because we have to report back to our government how these policies are implemented. So also we have to think at the last part of this process of making an implementation. Thank you.
I'm going to be 1 minute. Oh, dear.
So it's quite interesting, because I do think we have the solutions in this room, because following on what Rudo is saying, then we agree as specialists on this intersectional approach, but we go back to implement in our projects on care and so on, And then we have to unpack to policymakers to the Treasury, what we mean when we say resourcing for care. We're essentially saying they must allocate some money to health and education. So I think we do have the solutions in terms of, yes, institutionalize it within universities, within research institutes. That's the specialist area. But go back to talk about gender-based violence, as my colleague from Egypt was talking about earlier, to talk about sexual reproductive health rights, to talk about care. Just a thought.
Wait. Are there any more additions?
I think for me that's really interesting in terms of mainstreaming, because I think it needs to be now looking beyond institutions in terms of mainstreaming from a formal perspective. I think it also needs to be conditioned to a way of knowing and a way of being and a way of life. And because also for us, like for example, even when we work, like there are bare minimums of the African feminist principles and Africa feminisms. Feminisms are diverse, as we all know, but because we are all different, there are bare minimums whereby if I show up and I'm a different feminist as opposed to Dr. Jamila, I do not regress the progress that we've made as feminists, so that at the bare minimum, we are all having the same approaching intersectionality and using that lens, even where there might be differences. So I think that sort of reflexive solidarity, and Mohati really speaks a lot about the work around reflexive solidarity, where we forge a we even in differences. And that will also help in terms of making sure that even with the bare minimum, Jamila can still be able to be in a place where she can speak for me as a Kenyan woman without being a Kenyan woman, based on that reflexive solidarity that she's been able to use. So I think also rooting it back, and of course also as a Pan-African, also in terms of like the Ubuntu, like going back to that, because I feel like a lot of things have also, in the process of also using intersectionality, mainstreaming has also reflected back to a bit of individualism, because also depending on that differences, now I become a Black woman who's this, who's this, who's this, who's this. So me and you, we can never be the same because my problems, and we forget also the we that is in our similarities. So I think also that sort of foundation of like that Ubuntu sort of mentality, people need to also like go back to, because those principles that they had, for example, in the African Charter and the African legal system of peoples, it's a people's rights. They thought about people, are we, and we need to go back to thinking about are we. And if we move the way our ancestors thought, then we automatically have intersectionality, because intersectionality thinks of diverse. And so that automatically mainstreams even the thinking. So I think that also going back to the histories, which we've lost, of course, in the process of developing, sometimes will help the whole mainstreaming and making sure we represent each other even in diversity.
Okay. I think that concludes the discussion. But I think it also, if we pack it and we come back to the recommendations, I feel like there's going to be great conversations around recommendations and going forward in the room, especially with the grants discussion coming up.